This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. How can education reporters do a more thorough job incorporating science into their stories about students in schools, especially as the evolving research around COVID-19 continues to dominate discussions about how and when to reopen campuses? Today's guest is paying close attention to that question, and she has some smart ideas to share on how to approach this complex but increasingly essential element of the education beat. She's Hannah Furfaro of the Seattle Times Education Lab. Hannah, welcome to EWA Radio.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
I want to introduce you, first of all, to our audience. You've been a part of the Education Lab team at the Seattle Times since the fall of 2019. You previously were a science writer for Spectrum, among others. You also have a master's degree in science journalism from Columbia. Why does that topic interest you?
I became interested in science journalism when I was an education reporter, actually, at the Fresno Bee in California. I was a reporter there at a time when California was in intense drought. And on the education beat, I found myself writing quite a bit about kids who were living outside of the city. Maybe their parents worked in the fields in agriculture and their families were really affected by drought conditions. But I felt like I couldn't really write about drought and watershed issues in the way that I wanted to because I didn't have a strong science background. So I did my best, but I thought it would be helpful to pursue more education. And so that's why I decided to enroll in the master's program at Columbia.
And you learned a lot.
Yeah, I was really thankful to have mentorship from some really wonderful science journalists in New York. And I think, it's one of those things that I guess I didn't realize how much I didn't know until I was in the program. And so it was a 1-year sort of fast track way to become adept at writing about science. I've certainly learned a lot since then as well.
So Washington State was sadly home to the nation's first red zone in terms of the pandemic outbreak. What does school look like right now in the Seattle area? Are campuses open or kids predominantly at home?
So in Puget Sound, I think virtually all public schools are operating remotely for a majority of students. Certainly, most school districts have welcomed back students and some students in special education or other students who really can't learn remotely. But, most kids are at home working with their parents, working with their guardians, and of course, their teachers online.
There are obviously lots of questions, Hannah, that reporters should be asking right now about how schools can reopen safely. But let me ask you this. Can you give me what you think may be the top three?
Sure. I think that we should be asking what safety measures schools are putting in place when they decide to reopen. We also need to understand how well those safety measures will be carried out. Will children and teachers actually follow mask requirements? Will teenagers avoid socializing outside of school? That's another one. And then finally, I think we'd want to ask ourselves, some questions about what we know about the science of COVID in children. So what does it say about how well children transmit the coronavirus to others? And how important are they in the transmission chain?
That's been a pretty big point of controversy right now, nationally and internationally. Where does the research stand right now?
I think we're learning more every week. There were several studies that came out over the summer that suggested that children who are under 10 seem to be less likely to spread coronavirus than some of their older peers. But, the studies that we've seen so far are certainly not conclusive. I think there's still a lot of unknowns. Some of the studies have a really wide age band for children. So that, they might look at kids all the way from age 10 to 19, for instance. There's a lot that goes on between those years. So I think, we're still working on getting sort of a finer grained look at some of these things. But as I said, early indications are that younger kids are less likely to spread coronavirus, which I think would be good news for elementary schools. And certainly we've seen that many states have prioritized getting those younger kids back in Billings first.
The obvious focus right now for education reporters nationally is how, where, and when students are learning in the midst of this pandemic. So let's talk about what some of the big questions they should be asking themselves when they write these stories from that scientific perspective. What are a few of those questions you think they should be thinking about?
Certainly, I think that most school administrators are thinking a lot about safety. And so, as journalists, I think it's part of our duty to understand what safety measures would be necessary to bring students back into classrooms, either on a part time or full time basis. And when I think about safety, it's one of those things where at this point, in most corners of the country, there's no zero risk scenario for going back to school. So I think we need to understand, how administrators and state officials are weighing risk. We also should have a good understanding of how epidemiologists are thinking about this issue and how they're working with folks in the education world and also policymakers. So we should be asking epidemiologists questions like, what do we know now about how effectively children are transmitting or contracting coronavirus, and how is that debate evolving? So there's really a lot of questions that we could ask, but those are some of the big ones that I'm thinking about.
You had a story recently looking at some research by Washington State folks that was looking at the question of whether or not schools had to be doing a lot of testing for coronavirus in order to reopen safely. What did you find?
There's a group of researchers here who have really been trying to take the pulse on this question of how do we reopen school buildings and what would be necessary to do that in a way that minimizes risk. And so the latest work from this group, again, as you said, was looking at this idea of testing. So there's a number of ways that we can test for coronavirus here in the state of Washington. We've received a number of rapid tests from the federal government, and health officials are setting some of those tests aside for schools. As I said before, most schools are not open, so there's a big question, how would we use those tests? And this study essentially found that in places where coronavirus is under control in the community and schools are taking safety precautions like mandatory masks and distancing, it really wouldn't add a lot of benefit to do regular testing of staff and students. Those safety measures themselves really would be enough, as long, again, as coronavirus is under control. So I think it's good news, really, for districts that are lucky enough to be in areas where we're not seeing a lot of cases, because it means they wouldn't need that extra step of tests.
So if I'm an education reporter and let's say a school board member who wants to reopen schools cites this study in their comments at the start of a school board meeting, now I go and I get a copy of the study. What do I do next?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, if you're a reporter and you have a study like this in hand, I think one of the first things that you can do is get in touch with the principal investigator. And so this would be the person who was really spearheading the research. Oftentimes, it's someone who is in a professor position at a university. Sometimes a postdoc is leading the work, but you just want to get a handle on who that person is, reach out to them, and then have that initial interview where you can get clarification on their methods, their key findings, and what the big takeaways are. Next, I would reach out to folks who are not involved in the research but might know something about the methods, just to get a sense of their perspective and make sure that the study passes muster among other experts. That's always a good gut check and another way to ask some of those key questions about the research.
One thing that I think a lot of reporters already do, but it's worth restating, is to write up what you think the takeaways are from a study, get the researcher back on the phone, and walk through it with them. I mean, that's not cheating.
Absolutely, yeah. And the story that I worked on yesterday about testing in schools, that's exactly what I did. I went back to the main researcher, Dan Klein, and I went over some of these main takeaways. And it was just nice to have him on the phone and, listening to what I thought the takeaway was and just getting a sense of if that fit with what his findings were. Now, sometimes, there might be researchers out there who aren't as willing to say, hey, this is the big takeaway. They want to stick to the data. And that can be a little bit more tricky. But again, that's where those outside experts come in. They can help reporters understand what the implications of these findings are.
So let's go back to that school board meeting. But now, instead of presenting a study, a school board member has said they want to reopen schools. And when asked what they're basing their decision on, they say it's just a gut feeling. So now, as a reporter, I want to go out and try to find some research that either draws that same conclusion that the school board is going to take, or maybe it runs counter to it. Where do I go? How do I find those studies?
The best thing that reporters can do right now is to get on the list of some of the top scientific journals that are publishing articles that are related to what we care about. So for me, of course, I like to stay on top of the research on COVID in kids. That's a big one. And also, I'm looking for studies that talk about safety in schools. So for me, I'm looking to these local experts who are doing a lot of work in that area. And so I have these studies coming into my inbox, and I just sort of keep abreast of what's going on, and that gives me confidence so that if I'm in a situation like the one you described, I can know right away, okay, right, that school board member is on the right track, or no, there's not a lot of evidence to support that. I think being in a school board meeting on a daily deadline like that, it would just be nice to have the comfort of sort of having that familiarity with the literature. I think another thing that reporters can do is just get to know the epidemiologists at the university that's nearest to them, or at least ones, that they trust, maybe further, afield in their state or even outside their state, just to, again, have someone on hand who they can call right away and ask these kind of questions if they're uncertain. So those are two tips that I, would offer at this point.
So you've gone through the steps of what you do if you want to talk to that actual researcher and also ask other folks if they're familiar with this person's work and sort of vet that study, if you will. Is it inappropriate to ask a researcher, hey, who disagrees with you?
No, I don't think so. They may not tell you. From reporting on science in the past and also now, I think maybe to a lesser extent with coronavirus, but scientists might be competitive with one another. They might know someone has a competing study that's in the works. So, they may not be super ready to say who their competitor is or who might disagree. But, I think I've asked something similar to that question before and certainly gotten a response like, this person also does work in this area, or, maybe something a little bit cagey, but at least gives me a lead on who to reach out to. Another way to find folks who are doing similar work, just to get another opinion, is to look in the references section in a study. Oftentimes, researchers are referencing studies that are related, and that's where you can go and look for those other outside experts.
No, I think you made a good point here, which is, sometimes researchers don't want to necessarily talk about their conclusions, but it's important to include in stories what some of the limitations of a study would be. And I noticed that you were careful to do that in that latest story that we just talked about, the limitations of applying this idea that you may not need a lot of testing to keep kids safe. Talk about that.
Right. So most studies will include a section that's actually just called limitations, or sometimes it's in the discussion section of a paper. So you can go there, and oftentimes the researchers will just lay out very plainly, these are the things we couldn't look at for one reason or another, or here's some limitations in our methodology. And so those are things you would definitely want to ask a researcher to talk about during the interview. In the story that I just wrote, I talked with Dan Klein about the limitations quite a bit, and he was very open and honest about that. I think researchers really want to get across that one study is not the end all be all. It doesn't give us necessarily definitive proof of anything. It's just sort of adding to this iterative process that science is. So, yeah, I think as reporters, we always need to look for those limitations and hope that researchers will talk about them with us.
We're talking with Hannah Furfaro of the Seattle Times about how to incorporate science into education reporting. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Hannah, obviously right now it's arguably never been more important for education reporters to have a basic understanding of scientific research as it applies to school reopenings. But there's also a lot of controversy around this. What do you think right now about the position that education journalists, some of them I think may be a little reluctant to wade into this or to be seen somehow maybe as taking sides?
Yeah, I think that one of the really dicey questions that a lot of people are asking, whether it's us as journalists or families or teachers or school administrators, is when or how will it be safe to return to schools? And it's just such sort of a fiery issue right now. I certainly get emails after any story that tries to tackle this question, folks saying, your work is being passed around my school district and might influence decisions. So I certainly take the weight of this work to heart. And I think it's really difficult for us to try to answer that question with a yes, it's safe, or no, it's unsafe answer. I think the best we can do is just try to interrogate this idea of safety, what we mean by it, talk to epidemiologists, explain that there's no zero risk option. and also talk about what we just don't know right now. Like the story I wrote yesterday about testing in schools, that was really the first study that I saw that even tried to get at that question, do we need to do regular testing? And, there's still a lot of unknowns that I had to describe. We still, don't know a lot about COVID in kids. That's another thing. So we just should be honest about what we don't know. And that, I think, will help add balance and also context for our readers.
For reporters who may be hesitant, again, still to try to wade into this when they aren't sure which science to give the most weight, how should they be weighing this evidence?
I think that building trust with epidemiologists and other researchers, especially education researchers who have a good pulse on biomedical science, that is a really key way to sort of separate fact from fiction or decide which studies to give priority in our coverage. I think one thing that we should become familiar with is understanding some really basic things like sample size and understanding, is this a big study? Maybe not. And if it's not, do we want to prioritize this in our coverage? Is this researcher credible? What does their past research look like? And how did it add to the body of evidence? So these are all the kinds of questions that we can ask ourselves and also ask other researchers before we decide to write about something. Again, it's hard because a lot of research right now is just emerging or it's appearing in preprints, which means it hasn't been peer reviewed yet. So again, it sort of adds to the complication for us as journalists trying to do our job. But I think as long as we ask ourselves these hard questions, we'll be doing the best we can.
You talked about going to the study and looking for the limitations section. I think that's great that they give it that heading and it's easy to find. Should we also be looking at things obviously like the methodology?
Absolutely. I think that, we can look at the abstract, which is usually that block of text right at the top of a research paper. And that sort of gives us a good overview of what the researchers found and what they did and their sample size. But really, we need to dig into that methods section just to make sure that what the experiment was or what the research was actually aligns with what the findings are and that it reasonably supports those findings. It's not often, but sometimes researchers will make claims about something that really are not supported by the evidence or the way that they did their work. So I think it's just good for us to do that double checking.
I think that's a great point. And again, if we're going back to that imaginary school board meeting, it's worth going to a researcher and saying, hey, your study came up at a school board meeting and the school board member said X. Is that really what you meant?
Yeah, that would be a really good example of, a form of watchdog journalism, especially since policymakers have so much power in this moment. Here in the state that I live, Washington, school boards are making many decisions about whether or not to reopen schools. So when it comes to using our articles or using scientific journal articles, I think it's good for us to go back to those researchers and make sure that it's actually being used in the right way.
I'm curious how you're actually getting the job done right now, especially in this COVID-19 era of social distancing. Are you using things like social media?
I do use social media to source and also, just as a way to promote the stories that the Seattle Times, myself and my colleagues are working on. I find that a lot of scientists use Twitter. So I follow a lot of epidemiologists on Twitter. That's one great way to keep track of their new studies. They also have conversations, again, mostly on Twitter. So it's a helpful way to see how, these colleagues are interacting with each other and gives you a sense of the most important debates right now. So if I was giving one piece of advice to reporters who are trying to familiarize themselves with some of these conversations, I would say, see who's being quoted in some of these New York Times stories or Science Magazine stories and find them on Twitter and see who their circles are. It's really a great way to sort of dive in.
Have you adopted any other habits or practices that you can share that might be useful to reporters who want to follow your lead and get a little bit more up to speed on the health and safety questions around here?
One thing that I've been doing with some regularity is attending the pretty frequent Department of Health media briefings here in my state. And I'm sure that these are happening in other places. I think they hold them, several times a week here. And oftentimes they are reporting information related to reopening schools. Just this week, there was quite a bit of information during one of these briefings about testing in schools. And so that fit very well with the story that I was working on about the research that I described earlier. So I think it's just a great way, to sort of familiarize yourself with the top public health officials if you sit in, and then also just get a good sense of where the conversation is at with schools.
I think that's a really neat idea. And that's something that you can catch up on because obviously they're recorded. Unlike the old days when you might have had to try to catch a meeting in person to get the full impact, you could keep that on in the background.
Yeah, you can keep it on the background or, go back to it. Here they record it so that it's sort of a video or audio option. And that's just a really helpful way. If you can't do that every day or every week, at least you can go back and catch up.
What are some story ideas you'd like to see other reporters tackling right now around this issue of trying to incorporate science more into their daily beat reporting?
One thing that I'm really interested in right now, and I've sort of started to tackle, and I know some of my colleagues are interested in this too, is how well we are tracking coronavirus cases in schools. There are some researchers at Brown University who are doing an excellent job at crowdsourcing information from school districts right now. And it's basically the best database that we have to give us a snapshot of what cases look like, what outbreaks look like in individual school districts. But to my knowledge, there's no sort of comprehensive effort led by DOE. Oh, and in many states, states aren't necessarily collecting this information or making it transparent. So I would like to see more education reporters pressing their state officials and, national reporters pressing DOE to collect some of this information and really just get a sense of what outbreaks look like. And I think, honestly, it would be really helpful for researchers who want to ask this question but can't get grant funding to do it or are struggling to. I think it'll be important for building trust in communities that are looking to return to schools. Aside from that, I'm also just interested in sort of more nuts and bolts stories about how we return to school safely. Here in Washington, we've obviously been talking a lot about masks and social distancing, but I'm curious about what school buildings might need to do to retrofit themselves. Do we need new HVAC systems, things like that, and what that would cost. So I think that's another line of inquiry that we as reporters should be looking into pretty soon.
I think those all sound great. I'm also curious. I'd love to see some Q&As with some epidemiologists about how much of these studies are, kind of theoretical, because obviously you can't do a randomized trial where you give one school the purified air and the hand sanitizers and other kids are just left to fend for themselves. So, which of these studies are coming from things that were in non-school settings? We didn't have actual live little children who may or may not keep their masks on.
That's a really good point. And I think it'd be good for us, as education reporters to get a good handle on the value of those types of studies. Certainly the researchers who I've been writing about this week and in the past here in Washington are doing a lot of modeling. So it's just simulations of what might happen under certain reopening scenarios. And so it's good, I think, for us to sort of familiarize ourselves with. So yeah, I think that's a really great idea. Talk to researchers about that.
I know there's a lot happening on the education beat right now at the Seattle Times. What's on your plate?
As someone who's interested in science and children's mental health, there's certainly a lot of overlap with special education there for me and also youth mental health. And so I have really tried to prioritize those two areas in my coverage since the start of the pandemic, essentially. My colleagues and I, we've taken a close look at how students who receive special education services are or are not faring well right now. In the case of most school districts in Puget Sound, a lot of these kids just really aren't getting much face time at all with teachers. So that's something that I want to dig into quite a bit more. I know that there's been a lot of complaints that have been brought all the way up to the state level. So I want to take a look at those and better understand how state officials are addressing these issues. As I said, mental health is also a really big area of concern for me and one that I hear about almost daily from parents and students and teachers. So that's something that I want to dig into as well.
Hannah Furfaro is a member of the Education Lab at the Seattle Times, and she joined us from there. Hannah, thank you for making time for EWA Radio and for these excellent suggestions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.